Now, if you stop to think about it, there are some problems that come up pretty standardly with ethical relativism as I put it here. And note the strength of the claim of ethical relativism. When we say that ethics is dependent on culture, what this would mean is that there are no cross-cultural standards to judge between values across cultures. Right? So I can't say if something's right for someone in another culture, such as Japan, and likewise the Japanese couldn't judge what I do is right or wrong because the standards aren't across cultures. They're not universal. And note what this entails, that there are not universal ethical truths. And this is where we start to get into some problems. And so the first problem is just this, when we start thinking about that question, is ethical relativism self-consistent? The problem goes like this, that if we think about what ethical relativism says, it says there are no universal moral values. Well, that could be true. But now if we think of it differently, if we say the claim, if we put it this way, there are no universal moral truths, and now we apply that to itself, well, it seems that ethical relativism is itself a universal truth about ethics. And then the question is raised, is that consistent? Does that make sense? Can one self-consistently say that? It seems like at least there's one moral truth, if you're an ethical relativist, and that is that there are no other, you might say, moral truths. But if there's at least one, then that raises the claim, or the question rather, why can't there be others? Secondly, if we really take ethical relativism to heart, this really raises some serious issues. And these issues have to do with how we think about culture. So often this comes down to what we might call the Nazi problem, which often comes up in these discussions. So we might think of Nazism, particularly World War II Germany, as a culture. And so if ethical relativism is true, then it seems that we can't say, we being people outside of Germany, we can't say that Nazism was wrong, that the Holocaust was wrong. Or, pick your horrible cultural practice or act of genocide. Think about what that might be. If there are no cross-cultural moral truths, then we can't either praise or condemn what goes on in other cultures at all. And this seems far too strong a claim. That if we're going to talk about ethics at all, it seems like there has to be some kind of values that do exist across cultures, because we see these horrible practices. And in addition, we might observe that when we start thinking about what is culture, this gets to be very slippery very fast. Can Americans in the upper Midwest criticize those who are in the Southeast? Can Republicans criticize Democrats? Is there, we might call it Republican culture and a Democrat culture, right? So once we start talking about cultures and then subcultures, this becomes very, very fuzzy. All right, so this is the second problem. This concern that really the thesis is far too strong. And then a third problem is this, that usually people who advocate ethical relativism seem to believe that holding to ethical relativism leads to the principle of tolerance. So we should not hold that there are universal moral truths because this, it is so argued, entails that we are tolerant of other cultures. But of course, this really doesn't follow. If there are no values across cultures, then this doesn't entail anything about whether I should respect other cultures or not. That comes from my own values. Right? And indeed, if tolerance follows, then tolerance would be a universal principle. It would violate the principle of relativism. So this is another problem. And then finally, Oh, and I already mentioned this. So the definition problem, what counts as a culture anyway? So this comes up as well. Oh, I lost my spot. We'll get it back. Okay, now a further consideration comes up. How diverse are cultures? So folks who emphasize ethical relativism emphasize the diversity values across culture, and certainly there is diversity across cultures, but we might also note commonalities too, and some even point to infanticide as a way of thinking about the commonalities. So certainly it's the case that some cultures practice infanticide and some do not. But we might observe that the cultures that, or at least many of the cultures that have practiced infanticide, at least the famous instances, are cultures that live, we might say, near to the margins. So the standard example, at least in the ethics literature, is Eskimo peoples. And so certainly we may engage in some analysis, ethical analysis of whether it's appropriate, even in an Eskimo climate, the Arctic, to whether it's appropriate to engage in infanticide, even in those harsh conditions. But we can see perhaps how people could come to that conclusion. If there's 6 of us in a group and we can only support 6 of us, then that question of how do we support a 7th person comes into play. And if we can't, someone will die. So some decision has to be made. And so the commonality here would be this commonality of the value perhaps of life in general, and the recognition that life is valuable, even though sometimes we have to make hard choices. Now you might want to think if that's a proper analysis or not. It might not be, but that gives one way to think about it. And certainly when we look at cross cultures, we do see that there are commonalities. In general, murder is wrong. In general, lying is wrong. In general, honesty is valued, and so on. And if you think about it, to have a culture at all is to have certain kind of values. If we don't have prohibitions against murder, you're not going to have a society for very long. So the question that we might go back to now is, why is relativism so persuasive to so many? For a good many moral philosophers, the arguments against ethical relativism are so persuasive that it's something of a puzzle why individuals often are persuaded by it. And we might note this point we made previously about the unfortunate recent history, recent in the past couple hundred years, of imposing values, our values, Western values and others, with sometimes horrific results. So, colonialism, whether in the American context with respect to Native Americans, or the British in India, or the Germans or Belgians in Africa. There's lots of examples of Westerners coming in and doing horrible things. And so this becomes a reason for wanting to back off on imposing values on other people. And that makes a certain kind of sense, in fact, an important amount of sense. But now, keeping this in mind, we might think about 2 kinds of relativism, what we may call weak relativism versus strong relativism. So the strong relativism is what we've just been criticizing here, the claim that there are no absolute values across cultures. And this doesn't seem very plausible. But weak relativism seems much more plausible. So weak relativism basically is a claim that when you think about making ethical decisions across cultures, the values of those cultures of that place should be taken into account in the decision-making process. If one is looking out for the good of people, genuinely, the idea of simply forcing change on others seems to be very, very problematic. And so maybe this is where the real issue lies, is not so much in strong relativism, but trying to understand this weak relativism. To what extent and when should we take, for instance, when I'm making an ethical decision, when should I take into account, or how much should I take into account the values of others from another culture, and when are those values from another culture to be overridden for the values that I believe are important. And one way to think about that is think about what we might call universal human rights. And so this is something you might want to think about. Are there human rights that are universal across culture, no matter what? And if there are, then we start moving away from at least strong relativism to a more universal moral system.